There is a city on the coast of Africa where you can walk out of one country and, without ever crossing to another continent, stand on European soil. It flies the flag of Spain. It spends the euro, and it sends its own representatives to a parliament on the far side of the sea. And yet its only neighbor by land is Morocco, which has never once stopped calling this city its own. Its name is Ceuta. And across its long life it has answered to more masters than almost any city on earth. Phoenician traders. Carthage. Rome. Byzantium. Berber kings. Arab caliphs. Portugal. Spain. So many flags, over one small strip of rock, guarding the narrowest gate between two seas. How does a single city change hands that many times, and what would it feel like to live through every one of those changes? To answer that, we are not going to hand you a dry list of dates. We are going to give you a pair of eyes, and let them watch it all happen. So imagine, for the length of this story, a citizen of this city who simply never dies. He is not a king, and he is not a conqueror. He belongs to no empire and no state religion, he belongs only to the city itself. Across the centuries he is a fisherman, a merchant, a translator, a soldier on the wall, and above all a witness. Every flag that has ever risen over these ramparts, he watched it rise. Every flag that has ever come down, he watched it fall. He has no side to take, because he has buried people who loved every one of them. This is his city. Let him show you how it kept changing hands. His story begins almost 3,000 years ago, long before there was a Spain or a Morocco to argue over him. The first sailors to build here were Phoenicians, traders from the far eastern shore of the Mediterranean. They came for the reason everyone would come after them. This was the perfect place to watch the narrow water between two seas. After the Phoenicians came the merchants of Carthage, and the little port grew. Then Rome swallowed Carthage, and Rome swallowed his town along with it. The Romans gave it the name that still echoes today, Septem, meaning seven, for the 7 hills that ring the bay. They paved its streets, built a proper harbour, and raised a temple on the heights. For a while, the narrator lived the quiet life of a Roman fisherman at the very edge of the empire. But empires grow old, and Rome's grip on this coast slowly slipped away. Barbarian kings and raiders swept through North Africa, and the old order collapsed. Then, from the east, came the soldiers of a new Rome. The Christian empire ruled from Constantinople. They rebuilt the walls and held this rock as a lonely outpost, staring across the water at the kingdoms of Spain. And the narrator understood, more clearly with every passing century, the one truth that would rule his whole life. Whoever wanted to move between Africa and Europe had to pass through his harbour. That gift would never let his city rest. Then came the night that split his whole history in two. By this time the city was held by a Christian governor, a man the old chronicles call Julian. And far to the east, a new power had risen with astonishing speed, the armies of Islam, sweeping across all of North Africa. Their commander on this coast was a Berber general named Tariq ibn Ziyad. For his own reasons, Governor Julian chose not to fight these newcomers, but to help them. He opened his harbour and offered his own ships to carry an army across the strait, into Christian Spain. And so, in the darkness, the narrator found himself loading vessels that would carry a few thousand soldiers toward another continent. He remembers it still, the torches on the water, the smell of wet rope, low voices praying in 3 different tongues. Those ships slipped across the black water and landed beneath a great grey rock on the Spanish shore. The soldiers named that rock after their commander, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq. Soften those words in a Spanish mouth, across 1,300 years, and you already know the name, Gibraltar. Within a few short years, that single crossing had toppled an entire Christian kingdom, and Muslim rule reached deep into Spain. And all of it had begun in the narrator's harbour. His city was now the hinge between 2 worlds, Africa and Europe, Islam and Christianity. It would be fought over for the rest of time. For the next 700 years, the city belonged to the world of Islam, and under that world it truly came alive. Its harbour became one of the great ports of the western Mediterranean. Shipwrights built vessels here, divers brought up coral from the seabed, and the docks never seemed to sleep. In its markets the narrator traded coral and brass, leather and glass, spices and, above all, books. Have you ever wondered where the gold of the medieval world actually came from? Much of it crossed the great desert by camel and came out, at last, through ports exactly like this one. The city filled with scholars, judges, and poets, and its schools grew famous across the Muslim world. Around the year 1100, in these very streets, a boy was born who would become one of the greatest geographers in history. His name was Al-Idrisi, and one day he would map the whole known world for a foreign king. On Fridays the narrator prayed in the great mosque, beneath a ceiling of carved cedar and lamps of colored glass. But even inside the world of Islam, the city could not stop changing hands. It was ruled from Córdoba by the caliphs of Spain, when Córdoba was the most dazzling city in Europe. Then power passed to stern desert warriors from the south, the Almoravids. Then to another Berber empire, the Almohads, who ruled from Marrakesh. For a time the city even governed itself, under its own local lords. And finally it answered to the sultans of Fez, of the dynasty history calls the Marinids. Flag after flag, the narrator simply lived on, and the city stayed rich, proud, and always watched. He believed, as every generation believes, that this golden world would last forever. He was about to be proven wrong. Stop with him here for a moment, and look back at how far we have already come. A Phoenician beach, a Roman town, a Byzantine fortress, the launch pad for the conquest of Spain, then a jewel of Islam passed between 5 different Muslim powers. And we have not yet reached the moment most people actually remember, the moment this city changed worlds. Because across the water, a small, poor, ferociously ambitious Christian kingdom was ready to make history. By the early 1400s, the city obeyed the Marinid Sultan in Fez, the power we would today loosely call Morocco. Its walls were ancient, its wealth was legendary, and its harbour still guarded the gate of 2 seas. And that, once again, made it the most tempting prize on the whole coast. The kingdom that wanted it was Portugal, hungry for gold, for glory, and for a crusade. For years the Portuguese king prepared in total secret, telling no one the true target of his great fleet. Then, on the 21st of August, in the year 1415, the narrator woke to a sea full of sails. A Portuguese fleet had crossed in the night, carrying the King of Portugal and his grown sons. One of those sons would go down in history as Henry the Navigator. The princes had begged their father for a real war, a place to win their knighthood in blood. And they had chosen the narrator's city as that place. The defenders lit hundreds of lamps along the walls, hoping to seem far stronger than they truly were. It did not fool anyone. By the time the sun was high, armored men were fighting through streets the narrator had walked for 1,000 years. The governor held the citadel until nightfall, then slipped away with everyone who could still run. And the narrator stood in the smoke and watched the only world he had ever known end in a single afternoon. The people he had lived among for centuries were killed, enslaved, or driven into exile across the mountains. By evening, a Christian cross stood on a rooftop where the call to prayer had sounded that same morning. For Portugal, this one victory felt like a promise from God himself. It convinced a small kingdom that it could reach past the edge of the known world. And it did. Many now mark this exact day as the true beginning of Europe's long age of overseas empire. For the narrator, it was simply the day his home was taken, and the cruelest part was that he could not even die of the grief. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He stayed. Almost at once, the Sultan's armies came back to take the city, and for years they besieged these walls. But the Portuguese held, and Ceuta became the first stone in what would grow into a vast seaborne empire. Hungry for more, the Portuguese tried to seize the nearby city of Tangier, and there they were crushed. To free their trapped army, the Portuguese promised to hand this city back. As a guarantee, a royal prince named Fernando was given to the Sultan as a hostage. But Portugal could not bear to give up Ceuta, and so it never did. The prince died in a prison in Fez, still waiting for a freedom that would never come. Meanwhile, inside the walls, the narrator watched his great mosque stripped of its lamps and turned into a church. An altar rose where the prayer niche had stood, and a cross where the lamps had hung. He taught his mouth to shape Portuguese words, and offered himself as a guide to masters who knew nothing of these streets. But something essential had drained away. The caravans no longer came. The desert traders would not bring their gold to a Christian fortress, so they carried it to other ports. The rich city Portugal had dreamed of conquering slowly emptied into a lonely, hungry garrison. For 200 years Portugal clung to these walls, and paid for them in silver and in men. Then, far away, history played one of its strange and sudden tricks. The young king of Portugal marched off on a crusade into Morocco, and was killed with almost his whole army. Portugal was left with no clear heir, and its crown fell to the most powerful man in Europe, the King of Spain. In 1580, the crowns of Portugal and Spain came to rest on a single head. For 60 years, one monarch ruled both nations at once, and Spanish soldiers and settlers poured into the city. It was in these years that the mighty stone ramparts you can still see today, the royal walls, took their final shape. A deep channel was cut clean through the rock, turning the whole city into an island fortress. The narrator, who by now spoke every tongue of the strait, made himself useful once more as an interpreter. Then, in 1640, Portugal rose up and tore its crown back, and became a free kingdom again. And the city was left facing an almost impossible question. Its families were now Spanish. Its garrison was Spanish. Its trade leaned entirely toward Spain. So the city did something that almost never happens in all of history. It chose its own ruler. It refused the returning Portuguese king, and declared, of its own free will, for the crown of Spain. For a generation, the two kingdoms quarreled over the paperwork of that choice. At last, in 1668, a treaty signed in Lisbon made it final and lasting. Portugal formally handed the city to Spain, and Spanish it has remained ever since. The doorway between the continents now belonged, once and for all, to Madrid. But the rulers beyond the mountains had never accepted the loss of this coast. And in 1694, one of the most powerful sultans in Moroccan history set out to take the city back. His name was Moulay Ismail, and he did nothing by halves. His army surrounded the royal walls and settled in to strangle the city. The narrator carried water, powder, and messages along the walls, above the deep moat cut through solid rock. He assumed the siege would last a single season. Instead, it lasted more than 30 years. Stop and let that number land for a moment. Children were born inside these walls, grew old enough to carry a musket, and died defending them, without the siege ever lifting. It stands among the longest sieges in all of recorded history. Hunger hollowed the city from within, and the narrator buried friends he had known for lifetimes. The population thinned, whole streets fell silent, and still the walls did not break. Once, a great Spanish army arrived and drove the besiegers back, and for a moment the city dared to hope. But plague followed the soldiers, the relief force withdrew, and the siege closed again like the sea. In the end, it was not an army that saved the city, but a single death. When the old sultan finally died, and his many sons turned on one another for the throne, the besieging army melted away into the hills. After more than 3 decades, the narrator stood on the silent wall and simply breathed. The city had survived, again. But it would never again be the shining merchant capital of his memory. The sultans tried again in the years that followed, and again the walls held. The centuries after were quieter, and the city became, above all, a fortress and a garrison. In the 20th century, when civil war tore Spain itself apart, it was from these African garrisons that the rebellion was launched. And when Morocco won its independence in the 1950s, Spain kept this city, and its old sister city along the coast. In the 1990s, Ceuta became a self-governing Spanish city, with its own assembly and its own proud identity. And today, the narrator stands where he has always stood, on the same grey rock, above the same blue water. Behind him rises a modern Spanish city of around 85,000 people, with cafes and cars and a cathedral where his mosque once stood. In front of him runs a high border fence, and just beyond it, Morocco. Spain calls this city an inseparable part of its own nation. Morocco calls it land that should one day return. We are not here to settle that argument. Far wiser and angrier people than us have tried and failed. We are only here to notice what the narrator has noticed for 3,000 years. This remains one of only 2 places on the whole planet where the European Union meets Africa across a line drawn on land. And it remains, as it has always been, a doorway that people will risk everything to cross. He has watched them cross in both directions, under a dozen flags and 100 names, for 30 long centuries. Conquerors sailing north. The desperate coming north. Empires rising, and every last one of them falling. And if you asked him what all of it finally taught him, he would give you a very simple answer. No empire is permanent. No border is ever truly final. Only the city endures, and the narrow blue water it has always been condemned to guard. If the many lives of this one city moved you, there is a book I genuinely want to put in your hands. Roger Crowley's book Conquerors tells how the capture of this very city launched Portugal out across the oceans, and it reads like a novel you cannot put down. You will find the link in the description below, and using it helps support this channel at no extra cost to you. Every fact, date, and figure in this video is sourced, and all of those sources are listed in the description as well. Now I would like to hear from you. If you had lived in Ceuta, through all of this, which flag would you have called your own? And does a city like this one ever really belong to anyone at all? Tell me in the comments below. And if you want to keep standing at the forgotten crossroads of history, subscribe, and stay with us here at Blood and Banners.